guest today, I'm excited to say, is Dr. Andrew Mark Henry with the sensational YouTube channel Religion for Breakfast. So, Dr. Henry, will you tell us a little bit about yourself, about what you talk about on YouTube, and in general, just what moves you?
Sure. Wow, such a big topic. Just real briefly, I'm tuning in from Cairo, Egypt, and the internet infrastructure is not great here. So if I ever cut out for seconds at a time, it's because of that. Yeah, I'm a religious studies scholar. I focus on early Christianity, late Roman religion, a little bit of late Roman Judaism as well. The late, basically anything after the 300s CE up until about 700 CE, what I consider the more interesting corner of Roman history. Within that field of late Roman Mediterranean religion, I focus on magic, demonology, folk religion, kind of the popular down-to-earth rituals that people did to not die from dysentery, to try to survive childbirth, to curse somebody that might have stolen some of your property. So really like small scale social warfare sort of rituals, whether it's defending yourself from harm, cursing somebody that's one of your rivals. What we call magic, but this is something we can get into. Magic is a pretty, difficult to define term. On the YouTube channel, Religion for Breakfast is really a generalist channel for religious studies. So anything that falls under the category of religion, I do on the channel. That's everything from pop culture, like how has Japanese religion influenced Pokemon, to really nitty-gritty religious literacy content, like what is Islam? What is the difference between Protestants and Catholics? To some more theoretical topics, like what is a ritual? What is magic? So something that religious studies scholars do all the time is try to define and defend categories, which is kind of a problem when you call yourself a religious studies scholar. And one of the first things you grapple with in graduate school is what is religion? And basically no religious studies scholar has an answer. So you're constantly like deconstructing your own subfield. So yeah, it's kind of what I do.
So what is religion?
Yeah, thanks. For me, I always use the word, it's a mode of living. It's not like a belief system, because religion is so much more than what you believe. It's of course what you believe. It's also the rituals that you do. It's the ethics that you try to follow. It's who you hang out with. It's who you marry. It's the food that you eat. Think of like food laws across all of religion. So it's like a mode of living that involves beliefs and behaviors and senses of identity that are oriented toward the supernatural. I don't know if you necessarily need the supernatural in a religion writ large, but generally speaking, I think of like a family resemblances, that if it has rituals, if it has beliefs, if it has the supernatural, if it has like a hierarchy of priests and religious functionaries, it's probably a religion.
Okay. I feel like this is something we could really dig deep into, possibly in ways that would annoy you. So I'm going to skip to the side for a moment and say, I really admire your channel and the way that you're not afraid to get into some of those big questions that I think it can be pretty intimidating to deal with the public. I mean, you're always going to have someone saying, this nitpicking thing is wrong. But you do it responsibly. You tackle big questions and small questions. But part of what I'm interested to talk to you about is a little bit more of your particular focus, because I think that the time period you work on is an underappreciated part of Egyptian history that has a lot of overlap with medieval Europe, right? I mean, we're talking about the world in which the Roman Empire declines, falls, and has fallen, right? And as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, but when we're talking about Egypt and say 300 to 700, that's a firmly Christian Egypt.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, we can debate on how much Christianization has proceeded in like 550 CE. There's still Greco-Egyptian temples that are still functioning that time. But yeah, you're right. It's under the Christianized Roman Empire. Think of the emperors that are ruling during that period. You have Justinian, you have Constantine. Like they're Christian emperors. So yeah, for sure. And before the Muslim conquest of the region in the 600s.
And when do we see the last embers of formal pagan religion fading out in Egypt?
Let me see. I would say maybe the 500s. I mean, of course, you can't like pick a firm date here, but there's a temple down in southern Egypt called Philae Temple. It's a temple to the goddess Isis, and sometime in the 400s or 500s, I believe, it's actually like a cooperating. It's still being run by pagans, if we can use that term, polytheists, and Christians are starting to Christianize the space. So there's like a temple complex. Some of the space is being used by Christian monks. Some of the space is still being kept up by traditional Egyptian cults. So there is like a few hundred years of coexistence. What I also find interesting is a lot of rituals and practices that have a deep history in Egyptian history are kind of Christianized. So there's a practice called the ticket oracle. So a ticket like at a movie theater, and you would write a question on the ticket like, hey, should I move to Wyoming or California? And you throw the ticket into the shrine, and then you'll get an answer. That's usually like a temple functionaries back there writing the answers. So this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years into Egyptian history, and the practice continues but Christianized. So these little ticket oracle spots become shrines to saints. So St. Anthony, should I move to Aswan or should I move to Constantinople? And then you write the ticket, throw it in, get an answer. But now it's all Christian saints instead of Horus or your local, intermediary spirit. So in that respect, I would say there's a continuation of practice, but it's Christianized.
I think that's a really fascinating, thread that runs through religious studies, is where you have a continuation of practice or a continuation of a site, but the explicitly stated religion has changed, right? Is that something that you see quite a bit with magical practice too in this part of the world?
Yeah, I would say that magical ritual in particular, and we can even focus on the ticket oracle shrines too, but like people grapple with the same things through history. People grapple with sickness, they grapple with rivalries, problems with their business, problems with their crops. So a lot of these rituals, the problems they're dealing with are the same, but the idioms, the cultural idioms and symbols and gods and whatever change over the course of history. Sometimes what happens is what's called syncretism, which is kind of this, again, hazy term that religious studies scholars are sometimes hesitant to use, but it refers to like mixing and matching idioms or symbols from different religious systems. So you'll have magical spells, for lack of better words, magical formulas from Egypt that will call upon Michael the Archangel and Apollo at the same time. So you kind of like, when we think of Christianity as a very totalizing religion, like you believe in Jesus or you don't, it wasn't quite so firm for a lot of people back then. I actually like to split it, but instead of saying like orthodox and heretics, I say you have like syncretists and anti-syncretists, like the ones that are like, no, we're going to have a totalizing religion, and people that are like, oh no, let's who cares? Like this guy down the street calls upon Apollo and he has a great spell for helping my baby not die from dysentery. Well, this monk down the street, he calls upon this guy named Jesus. I think that's a pretty helpful place to get an anti-demon spell. I hear Christians are really good at anti-demons. And then there's kind of a more freewheeling world of ritual. And when we think cross-culturally, like I'd be curious to hear about, the Viking era, but like I suspect there's going to be similar problems that are dealt with ritually. The actual practices might look different, but the kind of the existential issues are cross-cultural.
Sure. Things related to theft, fertility, people, animals, and land.
Exactly.
Of course, a huge amount of medicine. And of course, I was interested when you mentioned demons as this sort of cross-religious concept, because you see that so much in the ancient medieval world. And talk about difficult terms to define. I mean, religion is one, but I think demon is a pretty hard one to define. What are we talking about when we say that someone expelled a demon? That stuff can seem so vague to me.
Yeah, like the idea of a malevolent spirit is pretty cross-cultural. I think you see that in like ancient Mesoamerica to ancient Japan, like evil, malevolent, invisible spirit. But as soon as you use the word demon, you are bringing in certain cultural baggage, whether that's from Christianity or the Greco-Roman world. Like the word demon itself comes from the Greek daimon, which is originally just like an intermediary spirit, or even like your own genus base or genius, basically. Like I think Socrates famously says like, oh, I have a daimon within me that inspires me. And he's certainly not meaning a malevolent spirit, but he's meaning some sort of like numinous soul-like animus.
Yeah, like a lesser supernatural being, not something to be propitiated in the same way as like a god. It seems like to me is about where that's at.
So this whole field is called demonology or daimonology, depending on you want. And there's just the world of intermediary beings. That's what I mean by intermediary. They're lesser than gods, they're greater than humans, but they're frequently very localized. Oh, a demon lives in that tree or that spring, or at least in like the Christian era, you start getting anti-paganism, anti-Semitism, like, oh, the demon lives in that pagan temple or that synagogue, and we have to have special ritual protection against these spaces. So it's highly localized. And so my hunch would be that it would be the same in European medieval European history, where you still have groves, you still have sacred springs. You know, the intersection of sacred space and demonological space, I think, is pretty frequent.
And that relates to a question I saw here in the comments. The Pikespy asked, weren't the old gods usually turned into demons in a recontextualization by Christianity? And then BK Winter adds to that and points out some might also be turned into saints, or their spaces recontextualized as saint spaces. I'm sure you see that kind of thing in Egypt. I mean, you just mentioned it with the oracle.
Yeah. A lot of the gods are reinterpreted as demons, usually by the Christian literati, though. So I'm sure your local peasant in rural Syria, rural Egypt probably couldn't care less. But I think the Christian theologian Origen, who lived in Alexandria, I think he has a whole passage about reinterpreting Zeus and Athena as demons. Which is interesting because they don't deny their existence. I think if you ask your average Christian today, they're like, oh, well, Zeus doesn't exist. A lot of these Christians are operating in a world of, oh, of course, Zeus exists. He's just a demon. And they live in a world where there's a lot of named demons. You have Asmodeus, you have all sorts of demons that have actual names that specialize in certain things. This is the baby killing demon. This is the scoliosis demon, stuff like that. So yeah, they're definitely contextualized as such. And actually the Origin is very interesting because he tries to theologize and not even theologize. He tries to analyze what pagan sacrifice is doing, and he basically says that the fumes from the sacrifice smell so good they attract these intermediary demons that live in like the ether, like between heaven and here, and it draws them closer. So the sacrifices are dangerous because they literally draw demonological agents into your proximity, so for him, like, sacrifice is like this very real dangerous thing. It's not just like, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. It's not holy. It's like, no, this is literally dangerous.
Right. I mean, this is a really fascinating difference from the way that I think a lot of Christian and post-Christians think today, because it's not just the pagan gods exist and their demons, but also worshiping them is effectual. Like, we're not even denying that these rituals do something, which is, I think, a pretty fascinating difference. And of course, you see that in the Middle Ages in Scandinavia too, where you have Christian writers who will say, well, Odin and Thor wouldn't even exist if God hadn't made them. And of course, that's a sort of strange thought to modern Christian or post-Christian thinking, because it's like, well, God made not only like rival gods, but these beings that do things that are rivalrous to his purposes. By the way, I had a question that I think is maybe a little bit of a field, but I want to throw it in. What is the linguistic situation in Egypt during the time that we're talking about here? What's the language on the streets? What's the status language? What's the language being used in churches?
Sure. Yeah. So it's I would say mostly Coptic, which is the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language. So you have what's basically just ancient Egyptian. And then a later form of ancient Egyptian is Demotic. So languages change over the time, over years, obviously. And then Coptic is heavily influenced by Alexander the Great conquers. Sorry, am I still here? It looks like I froze.
I hear you good.
Okay. So Coptic, I would say, is lingua franca alongside Greek. I would say Coptic is the language being spoken in the churches. The closer you get to the Mediterranean, it's mostly Greek. So Alexandria is very much a Greek city. And the further south you go, you get deeper and deeper into the heart of like Coptic Christianity. So some of the big cultural producers of that time were the monasteries. So in like Middle Egypt, there was this monastic federation run by this big head honcho monk named Shenouta. Everything Shenouta was in Coptic. All his monastic, all the monasteries in his federation were speaking Coptic. And in terms of status language, I would say it was probably Greek. I think like if you went to a law court or a government administrative building, probably Greek. Coptic kind of it slowly but surely took over those roles. But I think by the time Coptic the role of the administrative language, you know, there was the Muslim conquest and people were speaking Arabic by 10th or 11th century. I think there's a quote from a monk writing in the 12th or 13th century who laments Coptic kind of disappearing. So it took 400 or 500 years, and Arabic was the lingua franca.
I wondered why that happens with Arabic, but not with Greek, right? Because Greek has a presence in Egypt for that long or longer, but that's a whole other subject, maybe. You mentioned monasteries in Christian Egypt, and one thing I'm wondering about is, were these monasteries also transmitting any pre-Christian or polytheistic or classical lore alongside Christian lore in the way that you see sometimes in medieval Europe?
Yeah. I think the best evidence for that is what's called the Nag Hammadi codices, Nag Hammadi library. They're kind of famously and somewhat erroneously called like the Gnostic Gospels. A little bit erroneous. Not all of them are Gospels. It's a very mixed bag of texts. Some are like apocalyptic, theological, mystical texts. There's a copy of Plato's Republic in the Nag Hammadi codices, so it's not all, you know, Gospels as it were. And there's a really good reason to believe that the Nag Hammadi codices, which are these famously heretical texts, came from the nearby monastery of Pachomius. And Pachomius is like famous for like launching the monastic movement in Egypt. But I think it's like 4 kilometers away from where these were discovered. So very close proximity is this monastic monastery. And these codices were made, they were bound in these leather books that are kind of like paper mache. So you would take pieces of papyrus and kind of make a paper mache cover, and then you would cover it in leather. And if you start peeling apart that paper mache, you start noticing, wait, some of these are like letters from monks to and fro. So I'm convinced that at least some of those codices were produced at the Pachomius monastery, which I think really throws into question of like, oh, you know, monks are Orthodox and all these weird Gnostic heretics are off doing their weird Gnostic mystical stuff. And like the best educated people around who are writing in Coptic, the Nag Hammadi codices are mostly in Coptic, are monks. The ones that are interested in philosophical and mystical speculation of the universe are monks. So like it makes perfect sense to me. There's some counter theories that it might have been like a wealthy benefactor who was collecting these books and wanted to be buried them, and maybe they were books of the dead in a very long Egyptian tradition. Very interesting theory. I'm not complete. Basically, for me, the slam dunk is that the paper mache was partially letters between monks. So yeah, I would say definitely. But at the same time, Shenouta, that big head honcho monk I was talking about, he's just constantly complaining about people still worshiping the Egyptian gods. He's complaining about monks making amulets for other people. He's like, there's this monk that came by and tried to sell an amulet made out of a fox claw and a crocodile tooth, and how dare he? And whenever a monk writes something like that, I'm like, you're writing that because you're writing that from a position of precarity. There's probably monks everywhere doing that, and you're trying to stop it, and you only have so much coercive power. So right. Yeah, the monks were making magical amulets. There were monks making Gnostic texts. So we shouldn't think of this clean bifurcation between orthodoxy and heresy in any part of the ancient Mediterranean, let alone rural Egypt, you know?
And by the way, anyone feel free to throw in questions into the chat. Don't let me hog the questions entirely here. But I'm interested in this question about the amulets, because that seems to me to be exactly the kind of practice that's being continued and may continue extremely old traditions, in spite of a change of formal religion. Um, do we have archaeological examples of the amulets? Do we have texts that talk about like what you should put in an amulet for a certain effect? Like, do we have that kind of documentation?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And a lot of this comes from Egypt because the Egyptian climate preserves so so much material that disintegrates in other parts of the Mediterranean. So we find amulets in places like Syria, Asia Minor, Greece that are like bronze, that made out of metal. So some of the stuff I studied in my dissertation were a lot of bronze amulets that have a picture of the rider saint. It basically looks like Saint George, who he's on a horse spearing usually a dragon in medieval depictions, but in late antique depictions, it's almost always a demon.
Hmm.
And it's not always Saint George. It's sometimes Saint George, but it's often Solomon, because Solomon kind of turns into this demon hunter by the Second Temple Jewish period and the late Roman period. And this other somewhat obscure saint named Saint Sicinius. So there are rider Saint Sicinius amulets everywhere. In Egypt, we find a lot of papyrus, so actual like pieces of paper, sometimes with just a single line of the first verse of one of the Gospels. So if you've read any of the Gospels recently, it's a pretty boring first sentence. It's like, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, just like really boring sentences. And a lot of these amulets have a single line of the gospel, and then they have little creases on it, which show that they're folded. They're either folded up and put onto a necklace or into like a little casket that you wear around your necklace, or maybe into a pocket. So there's theories that like by having a single verse of the first verse of a gospel, you're basically channeling the magical power of that entire gospel in this one piece of papyrus. We also see the Lord's Prayer on amulets. So obviously a very it's an oral formula, something that you chant all the time. You would have heard chanted in churches. It ends up in amulets. And again, who's going to be making those amulets? Your local monk, your local priest. Lines from the liturgy shows up. So like the phrase "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty." So this is a liturgical phrase that's chanted in every branch of Christianity to this day, every Sunday, and it shows up everywhere in amulets, including those bronze ones I mentioned from Greece and Asia Minor, Syria, as well as liturgy, verses, prayer. Basically anything Christian-y you can think of that has like some sort of sacred oomph to it, you can imagine it's shown up on an amulet somewhere.
Huh. And that's, I mean, these kinds of apotropaics remind me of protections from revenants in Eastern and Northern Europe too, right? Where it's often a prayer or a cross or something to that effect. But it's interesting to me that, of course, as you mentioned, the people who would know how to write these, who would know the right words and the way to put them on paper, are officials of the Christian religion, and there's no instructions for how to make anything like that in the Bible, right? I mean, there's some acknowledgement of something like demons, but in general, Scripture. Correct me if you have a different impression. Is a little bit anti-magic. But I guess it depends on what you consider magic. So,
yeah. I mean, you're hitting on the vexing question of what is magic. Yeah, I'd say the Bible, the New Testament in particular, is somewhat anti-magic. I think the Apostle Paul, I think in the book of Galatians, has this list of sins. Don't fornicate, don't steal, don't murder, and then he throws in this word pharmakia, and you can kind of hear the word pharmacy in there. So our modern term pharmacy back then was probably closer to like substance-based sorcery. So whether that's potions or poisons, it's a term for illegitimate ritual that I don't like, that's substance based. So when we say magic, we're trying to use we're trying to categorize a bunch of rituals that the ancient people had so many more words to describe it. You had pharmakia, which was substance based. You had goetia, which is like evil sorcery that's sometimes more dark. And then you have magia, which is sometimes just a catch-all phrase and sometimes specifically referring to the magi, the Persian religious functionaries that do Persian religious stuff. So it's not always magic. It's sometimes just like sacrifices and divination and things that priests do. So there's always this slippage between our English idea of magic and the ancient idea of illegitimate ritual. And obviously, as soon as you say illegitimate ritual, you're dealing with subjective polemics. You're not really using a scholarly term. So I try to avoid using the term magic as best as I can. I try to use much more pointed words like cursing, healing, exorcising, words that kind of refer to a specific thing. Healing is like bringing you back to health. Cursing is trying to make someone unhealthy. Exorcising is trying to expel malevolent spirits from your body. So it's much more targeted in the same way that the word sacrifice generally refers to like slaughtering an animal, where it's a much more targeted word. Magic is just like bull.
I see what you're saying. I mean, actually, this is the analogy that's coming to my mind is in my studies of color terms across languages. You have, one language where there's not one term for red, but there's like a light red and a dark red. But then you have another language where red and orange and yellow are all one color term. And it's not that people don't see the differences, is that they're not categorizing the same way. So there's not an ancient category of magic the same way that we might talk about it today as just like supernatural effect that a person can do. Because I guess in a sense, prayer could be considered magic. Divination certainly strikes me as being magic in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. And as soon as I notice a lot of knee-jerk reactions to try to differentiate between like magic and miracle. And as soon as people start trying to make those distinctions, I just whip out an example from the late Roman world where it goes against that idea. So people will say, oh, Jesus didn't do magic because his miracles don't require paraphernalia or substances. He just touches or he just walks across the water. But then I'm like, well, there's a guy named Simon Magus who's literally called Simon the Magus, who also just does miracles without substances. He starts flying. He causes like angels and demons to like come forth from him and do his bidding, all without, magic words, without an amulet. So I'm like, is Simon doing miracles there? Like,
Right.
You're basically trying to impose a supposedly objective category, but you're imposing a subjective category on these. Objectively, they're doing the same thing. They're doing what I call just thaumaturgy, just wonder working. I'm a little more comfortable using magical as an adjective because then it's trying to describe the potency and efficacy and agency of a ritual. But then that gets a little dicey where I'm like, okay, that prayer is particularly magical because if your airplane starts crashing and you start praying, hey, God, please don't let this airplane crash. How is that different than someone saying like, picking up an amulet and saying, Zeus, don't let, there's so many ways I could describe the ritual technique to make the ritual technique not that different between what this, legitimate saint is doing versus what that Magus over there is doing.
We've asked you to define religion. We've asked you kind of to define magic. Part of what I'm seeing in the comments is, well, what is ritual? Right. So
Yeah.
BK Winter gives the example like is taking medication from a doctor a ritual.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those like, okay, so there's several ways we can describe ritual. Sorry, I'm pulling up my notes right here because I do have a video on this topic. The one way you can describe ritual is very simply like a way of marking difference. So whether that's marking difference in time, so we are now entering the Eucharistic time where we are, approaching the table of the Lord. It's a way of marking substances to be different. So this is basically marking the mundane, what's the profane and the sacred. Sacred and the profane, these are two terms that come up all the time in religious studies. Profane kind of has pejorative connotations in English today, but it really just means mundane, the non-sacred. So if you are just eating a meal for Thanksgiving that's just a profane meal. But if you do rituals that then try to sacralize it, so actions that would sacralize it would be a ritual. So any action that would transition it from profane to sacred. That's kind of the way that I define it. So in terms of like, would taking medication be ritual? I would say it could be ritualistic or ritualized given a specific context. Like if you were creating like this space, like now it's my medicine taking time, and it is kind of trying to partition time and space in your daily life. I think that I could get on board with calling that ritual. But gets kind of dicey. Because like I don't know if I would call that sacred. I would say it's marking difference. And the scholar Jonathan Z. Smith, it says all it is marking difference is for him as ritual. For me, there has to be like a connotation of sacred.
And it seems to me that there's often in the process of sacralizing something some process of cleaning or purifying oneself or the environment or something to be used. Would you say that's a fairly universal component of sacralization?
Yeah. So one of the necessary readings for any graduate student in religious studies is to read Mary Douglas. She's an anthropologist. Her famous book is called Purity and Danger. So I would say not all ritual has to do with purity, but obviously purity is a major cross-cultural deal. You have, in Shinto, or in Japan in general, I think this is at Buddhist temples as well, there's the Temizuya ritual. So you wash your hands and your mouth before you enter the sacred space. So again, this is differentiating profane and sacred, but there's this cleansing ritual. You have, when Muslims go on the Hajj, you're supposed to enter a purified state. You have to wear a certain type of outfit, abstain from certain types of actions. So in terms of purification, that's cross-cultural. The way that Mary Douglas defines purification is getting rid of dirt. And she uses the analogy of dirt as matter out of place. So when dirt is in a garden, that's where dirt is supposed to be. But if dirt gets on my hands, if it gets on my table, if it gets on my shirt, suddenly that is no longer nutritive soil, that's dirt. It's matter out of place. So she says, look cross-culturally, whenever the term purity and impurity, whenever polluted and pure are invoked, matter is being deemed out of place. So that's like, oh, this, in the Hebrew Bible, you have this woman is on her period. She has to be sequestered. So she is matter out of place. You can think of so many types of, whether it's sexual laws, whether it's clothing laws, whether you can enter the space or not. It's always trying to distinguish between dirt and soil, matter in its place, matter out of its place.
And to
this
me,
is pretty that's religious studies theory 101.
And to me, that seems to be one of the interesting things that stands out about, say, the Sermon on the Mount, is moving some of that sense of purification to the inside, right? To like, it is not.
Yeah, that's really.
You've already committed adultery in your heart, right? That sort of thing.
That's a really good example. Because in Second Temple Judaism in general, you have this idea of ritual impurity in Judaism. It comes from the Hebrew biblical Levitical laws. So many things can put you into ritual impurity, but a lot of these things, most of these things, are not sinful. You touch a dead body because you're at a funeral, you're in a state of ritual impurity. That's not sinful. You have sex and you're in a state of ritual impurity. That's not sinful necessarily. But you see a development in Second Temple Judaism among certain sects of Judaism where it does become sinful. So the community that lived at Qumran, which is this small, almost monastic community where we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had a much more heightened sense of ritual impurity where it was somewhat sinful. And their entire compound was basically purpose built to cleanse themselves of impurity. So you have the ritual bath called the mikveh, which Jews use to this day. But you plunge in the mikveh to cleanse yourself of ritual impurity. But for these Qumranites, like they would enter ritual impurity so much they had to constantly be cleansing in these really big mikveh that are like just stationed all over this little place that takes maybe 3 minutes to walk across. Like it's a small little compound. So I always think in terms of that when I see like the rise of baptism, like what was John the Baptist doing? And I haven't really read the scholarship, but my hunch is it's probably connected to these theological and ritual changes that we see in Judaism in the first century, both first century BCE and CE, kind of around that 200-year time span, where ritual purity and morality start to become increasingly intertwined.
In a way that I think is sometimes pretty not intertwined, very, very visibly in ancient polytheistic religions. And I think that's one of the hardest things for people to get over in understanding those religions sometimes. I'm gonna take this down a slightly different track for a moment. By the way, again, folks, feel free to throw in questions in the chat. What brought you to Egypt?
Sure, yeah. So I've just finishing up a postdoc here. So for those in the chat that don't know, postdoctoral fellowship is usually like a 1 to 2 year position, mostly a research position that a lot of academics do, obviously, after their doctoral. So I graduated from my doctorate program in 2020 and then started this postdoc at the American Research Center in Egypt, which is a nonprofit research organization that's kind of under this larger umbrella. It's like the Council of Overseas American Research Centers. The project I was focusing on was on Coptic iconography. So if anybody's walked into an Eastern Orthodox or Coptic Orthodox church, you see pictures of the saints, you see pictures of the Virgin Mary, but they're very specific sacred types of pictures called icons. Coptic iconography has this long, illustrious history. You'll notice that a lot of the icons in Coptic history look like those Fayu mummy masks that I was talking about. So there's a long artistic history there. And my project was trying to marry these topics of folk ritual and magic to something that we usually consider very institutionalized, icons of the holy saints. But we have all these instances of the saints being kind of interactive, where like, hey, I'm sick, so touch the icon, or hey, that icon over there is like weeping oil. Let's go collect that oil and then anoint our sick baby with that oil. So you get this really interesting cross-pollination between the institutionalized realm of iconographic artwork and what's the everyday person concerned about. Not dying, not getting sick, having a good socially advantageous marriage, being able to travel from Aswan to Cairo without getting robbed by bandits. And then how does iconography play into that?
Very interesting. I mean, I can see how the line between an icon and an amulet could get pretty blurred.
Yeah, the example I'm thinking of right now is not from Egypt. I think it's Asia Minor or Syria, but there's a duo of saints that invoked together, Saints Cosmos and Damien, kind of doctor saints. Sorry, am I still here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, now you're not.
So Saints Cosmos and Damien are doctor saints. They're kind of known for healing in a more stereotypically medical sort of way with like surgical tools and stuff like that. But after these two saints, die, they go down into history as just kind of like the all-round healing saints. And there's a story of a Roman soldier that would keep a little pocket-sized icon of Cosmos and Damien like in his pocket. Like he'd walk around in his wallet with these saints. And his wife is sick once, and she says, like, I saw in my dream Cosmos and Damien visit me. And then her husband's like, well, I keep them in my pocket all the time. So like you have, I don't know if we have actual archaeological evidence of like pocket-sized icons, but we have stories, hagiographical stories of pocket-sized icons that people apparently carried around with them.
And there's some parallels to that, I think, in the polytheistic Norse world, where someone carrying a little statuette of a god says he has, Freyr or Thor in his pocket. or that the idol itself is addressed as that being, some kind of a sense that it's embodying it, which I think has something to do with the graven images problem in the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a whole iconoclasm thing too. So there was a bit of a kerfuffle among Christians on graven images as well.
A little bit.
And then I mentioned the writer saint, Saint George or Saint Sicinius or Solomon, however you want to identify him. There's so much overlap between the amulet world and the institutionalized, the painting on your wall world. So one of these monasteries, it's called the Bawit Monastery in Middle Egypt, has this amazing fresco of Saint Sicinius, just beautifully painted, stabbing like a female demon. Her name's Abizu, who is known for killing babies. And it's just the exact same image that you find on amulets. So these official monks had this beautifully rendered, professionally rendered fresco in their monastery, and the person down the street probably had Sicinius stabbing a demon in their pocket or around their neck. So there's just so much overlap between the institution and the day-to-day life in late antiquity of all places, not just Egypt, but Egypt just has the most data.
And I have to wonder if that same person carrying around a small version of the same image regards that larger, more professional image as more potent also. Right? I wonder what that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. If I could go back in time as an ethnographer and just see like how was that painting interacted with, like would the monks touch it, would they kiss it? I'm sure they did, but that's just complete speculation. But yeah, I mean, the icons were viewed as the historian Peter Brown, he uses the term the power and the presence, the potentia and the praesentia of the saint in that object. So it was kind of a window to interact with the saint, and that could be accessed either through a very fancy icon in a church or in a pocket-sized amulet.
Well, and that seems to me then to start blurring the lines towards sympathetic magic, right? Where a voodoo doll represents the person that you're stabbing.
Yeah. And we get that in the Roman Empire too. There's this ritual called defixiones. They're also called binding spells or curse tablets. They're pieces of lead that you would write a curse onto it. I curse so and so for stealing my hoodie. May Sulis Minerva call down death upon him. And a lot of these curse tablets try to draw a sympathetic connection between the target and the actual lead. And this is one theory why lead was so common, because it's dark, it's heavy, it's cold. So these spells will say formulas, spells is such a charged term. May Andrew be cold, just like this lead is cold, trying to draw sympathy between what's written. And these we find everywhere. We find them buried in hippodromes, chariot racetracks, and be like, I curse the green team, may their horses trip, and they're buried underneath the starting gate. So you just imagine like you're in 4th century Antioch and you really want the blue team to win. So at night you sneak, bury the curse tablet under the green team's starting gate. Like it's just hilarious. I think it's so interesting. It's just something that doesn't pop up in like, sword and sandal movies today.
Yeah, but it's very human. I mean, what?
Yeah,
I got a lot of denarii riding on the blue team.
Yeah. Somebody's asking a good question in the chat. Is there some kind of universal rule on who gets to become a ritual specialist in early societies? Ritual specialist is kind of the catch-all term that scholars, at least in my field, like to use. We don't like to use the word magician. It's just, do you have a particular specialty in a particular ritual? Jesus presumably was a specialist in exorcisms. Monk A or B could have been an expert in amulets. In terms of expertise, it could be something as simple as literacy. So the monks knew how to write. They knew how to run the liturgy. So that's a ritual expert. That's a specialty in Christian liturgy that can then be imported into an amulet. It could be something like charisma. So somebody that knows literacy, it's the hermit that lives out, but he's charismatic enough that you're like, this is the guy I need to go to get the anti-dysentery amulet. So I would say charisma or literacy, an actual learnable skill as two different like poles maybe not necessarily mutually exclusive poles, but like types of ritual expertise: charismatic ritual expertise, intellectual ritual expertise.
And that charisma strikes me as almost in its way a type of magic. I mean, it's hard to explain why one person has that or doesn't have it, but I think a lot of it almost seems to do with just this human draw that we have toward, oh, this person seems confident about what he's saying or doing. He must be competent in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a certain amount of like self belief there, which almost seems to me magically generated showmanship, Estella says. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting what you said about actually viewing Jesus through that lens of a ritual specialist, as a specialist in exorcism. I mean, certainly reading the Gospels, I think it's an interesting lens to read him through as a.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more vexing questions in my field is, parsing what parts of the gospel go back to the historical Jesus, what parts are just embellished later. I tend to think he was probably some sort of exorcist. I'm agnostic on the question of whether demons actually exist, but there's no doubt that people position themselves as exorcists, say, hey, I have ritual power over malevolent spirits. Come to me, I'll fix your malevolent spirit problems. But some of the earliest attacks against Jesus you can see in the Gospels, and some of those attacks are like, oh, he's possessed by demons. He gets his power through Beelzebul, who's one of these head demons. And those sorts of accusations tend to have been leveled against people that are called, magos, so magi, or magicians, as it were. So my thinking is, if he was getting these accusations as early as the 1st century, there's a chance he was positioning himself as such. And we do see a lot of Jewish exorcistic practice in the 1st century. The Qumran community that I mentioned before, we find some anti-demon formulas in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Josephus mentions a Jewish exorcist. So this is like a known ritual specialist class, as it were, in 1st century Judea and Galilee. So yeah, I view it through the lens of ritual specialty. And I would view it through the lens of freelance ritual specialty. So you have institutional, like Shanuta is an institutional monk who has institutional power behind him. Somebody like Jesus or John the Baptist, they're the roving guys that are probably deriving their skill from their charisma. So it's more of a freelance, non-institutional sort of ritual expertise.
And coming back to Egypt for a moment, I'm kind of getting curious about whether you notice in present day Islamic Egypt any kind of continuity with the ritual and belief that you see in late antique Egypt.
Yeah, late antique world, maybe not so much. I just recently went to a mosque in the Egyptian Delta in the city of Tanta, that was for a Sufi sheikh. I think his name is Badawi, from sometime in the medieval period. And his tomb is in that mosque. And I was there during one of the more recent Eids, one of the more recent Islamic festivals. And the mosque was just a hangout place. Everybody was hanging out there. They were picnicking. People were going in and out of the mosque, presumably to go visit his tomb. So, whether that's coming from late antique practice or is that just a cross-cultural thing to do? You go to the tomb of the famous religious functionary. But for me, that is popular level of a very popular level religion. Just go to hang out at the Sufi guy's tomb at his big mosque and just make a day of it. And I found that pretty interesting.
And the Pikes by asked in chat here, and I think you've touched on this a little bit, but often we associate the whole demons and exorcism thing through a Christian lens, but aren't many of these traditions based in Judaism?
Yeah, for sure. And you have the concept of malevolent beings in Judaism as well. Famously, I think I have this on my shelf too. First Enoch, it's a Jewish document. It's a text that was very popular among Christians, but it's a story of these angels coming down to earth and having sex with human women and propagating a whole species of giants, and they're kind of viewed as like these Ur demons, like these first demons. So the idea of malevolent spirits, it goes deep into Jewish history. Obviously Jesus was Jewish, and he's out there exorcising demons left and right. So yeah, I think when we think of demons, we think frequently of Christianity, just because Christianity happens to be the largest religion on earth, and particularly in the United States has a lot of cultural visibility. But yeah, Second Temple Judaism, all the way into late antique Judaism, we see a whole world of demonology and Jewish magic. There's a text called the Sefer HaRazim, which is like a late antique Jewish text that's just a bunch of magical spells, most of which using angels. So we also think of angels as like Christian, but Sefer HaRazim is like, here's the name of the angel you need to call upon. And when you call upon this angel, they'll do this for you. And it's just almost like a ritual handbook. The book of Tobit that appears in the so-called Deuterocanon, that's recognized by a lot of Christians today, is a Jewish text, and it has this kind of arch nemesis Asmodeus demon in that book. So yeah, Jewish literature chock full of demonological overtones. So yeah, definitely not just a Jewish Christian thing, not just a Jewish thing. And I would say it's Greco-Roman polytheism too. You have a lot of beliefs start mixing and mingling in the late antique period. So you'll have someone that is not a Christian, but they believe they start using the idioms of angels and demons as a way to distinguish malevolent and non-malevolent intermediary spirits.
Mm. Yeah, it seems to me that in a more ancient text, demon can be more benevolent, more malevolent, but then that the angel term starts to apply more to like those more benevolent, what would once been called demons, more neutrally. And he asks as a follow-up, I assume the whole lesser key of Solomon is much later in origin, though.
Yeah, from my understanding, that's more medieval magic. This is like Testament of Solomon that's late antique period. There's a whole story about building the temple, the first temple to the God of Israel, kind of using the power of demons, like he lassos them basically and then bends them to his will. It's a really interesting text. So Solomonic magic has a very deep history into Judaism. So that Jewish exorcist that I mentioned from Josephus, his name's Eleazar. And according to Josephus, he does an exorcism in the court of Vespasian, and he actually uses a Solomonic ring and says that he draws the demon out through the nose of the demoniac, which I just think is so interesting and visceral. Like you have this ring of power, and you're like pulling a demon out through the nostrils. Like we think of demons as ethereal, like you can't really weigh a demon, but in antiquity, 100%. This is before Descartes, so there's no mind over matter. Everything is matter. So demons have substance. So remember, let's go back to the beginning of our conversation about Origin saying that demons can smell the fumes from a sacrifice and want to come eat those fumes. Like demons are physical in the ancient metaphysics. So this idea of Solomon as this demon hunter goes back well before the Christian period. It's a Jewish innovation that continues on into late antique Christian practice with the Testament of Solomon, because I would say the Testament of Solomon is more of a Christian text, well into the medieval period.
Huh. I mean, we see some very similar stories in the Norse world. One of the early Christian figures in Iceland is Samuel Frothy, who goes to study in France at a church there and wants to go back to Iceland quickly. So he makes he tricks the devil, and the devil turns into a seal to carry him back to Iceland. And then I can't remember what he promises him, but the seal devil swims him back to Iceland and drops him on shore, and then says, well, you have to give me whatever it was that you promised me. And Simon thwacks him with his Bible and chases him off. But it seems like a similar kind of like surprisingly physical manipulation of even an evil intermediary, even the supreme evil intermediary, as a means to get to a good end. So I know that you have a hard exit here. Would you like to conclude by maybe telling us about some of your videos that we could follow up on some of these subjects with?
Sure. I saw somebody post this in the chat. My recent video was Jesus a Magician. Gets into a lot of the topics I just talked about. Some people in the comments of that video were complaining that I was just playing semantic games, and I'm like, this is what it's all about, though. What do you mean by magician? What do you mean by magic? What do you mean by ritual or a miracle? So a lot of it is kind of pulling apart and problematizing these categories. And I kind of come to the conclusion, oh, Jesus is a freelance ritual expert. So that might be unsatisfying for you, but it's a video that I'm pretty proud of. And just like non-commodity stuff, I have a video on the Coptic language. I have a video on Valentinian Christianity, which is like a Gnostic form of Christianity. So I would say check those out. And then on the YouTube channel Patheos, Patheos, I have like a 15 episode series on biblical archaeology. So it's examining the world of the Bronze and Iron Age through the lens, a secular academic lens. So I'm pretty proud of that series. It was made in collaboration with like a dozen different archaeologists of the ancient Near East. So
very cool. And I appreciated your Coptic language video with someone who's interested in the language stuff quite a bit. Of course, one of your most recent videos is about Iceland.
Yeah.
But in addition to your YouTube channel, let me recommend that people follow you on Instagram, where you post some amazing photos from historical sites in Egypt and environs.
Yeah. So yeah, my Instagram is at Andrew Mark Henry. I try to, I get around Egypt, so a lot of pictures. And I used to work in Jerusalem on my dissertation at another research organization there. So you'll sometimes see throwback pictures from that region as well.
Yeah, I think you're a top 10 Instagram follow for me.
Oh, cool.
Well, like I said, thank you very much for taking the time, and in spite of the hard exit that had to come up. But I was glad to have a chance to pose some questions to you and get your take on religion and magic and ritual, and hope to have you back to talk about this a little bit more, hopefully when our schedules align a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. I hope people got something out of it.
Yeah, maybe see you in Denver in late September.
Yeah, I'll be out. There's a huge religious studies conference out there in Denver, so stay tuned.
All right. Well, thanks again, and all the best, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.